We've got everybody really well trained here. You know, they came back almost on time. Only took 2 days. Okay, so we got a talk by John Rosenfield, and then we're going to get the rest of the folks that presented throughout the day down here. We're going to have a little general discussion. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to John Rosenfield, the Bay Institute.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for staying awake through a day and a half of presentations. You're brave people, so I appreciate your time listening to all these talks. I know it's the end of a long set of talks, and so I'm going to try not to overwhelm with very detailed analyses, but try and rather set a broader context for what we've talked about. I think that when I talk about, or when I hear people talk about in Delta hydrodynamics, I get the sense that we are definitely in the weeds and missing the forest. So hopefully some context will help. So in that spirit, I measured this room yesterday. And if you guys on the panel could look to the far end of the room just to get a sense of how big this room is about 13,900 cubic feet. So if we were in a dip in the South Delta enjoying ourselves and the pumps came on, a month ago the pumps were running combined exports of about 6,800 cubic feet per second. So it would take about 2 seconds for this room to be evacuated of all the water that we imagine is in it and all of us. And then it would be evacuated again, and then it would be evacuated again. So this just gives, I think, a little visceral context to how much water we're talking about, pumping out of this system, and all the contents that are in that water getting pumped out of the system as well. Again, for more context, we're here today because we have experienced decades of steep decline in numerous fish species in this system, and I'm showing 4 species here. In each case, the y-axis is log transformed, and the x-axis is a period from 1967, about when the State Water Project began to operate in the Delta, to now, a little bit earlier or later for winter run Chinook salmon. But the point of this is we see huge declines on the order of 90, 99%, sometimes 99.9% declines, and that the declines have happened over this whole period, going up and down depending on hydrology and other factors. But the declines did not start 5 years ago when the water clarity might have changed, or 10 years ago when the pod, whatever caused that, began, or 20 years ago when the clam invaded, right? I mean, these declines have been going on. All of those things are certainly exacerbating a bad situation, but the declines have really been going on for 50 years or more. When we talk about altered delta hydrodynamics, we immediately begin to focus on fish and salvage and what's the difference between salvage, expanded salvage, and entrainment, et cetera. I just wanted to make the point here that we also tend to focus on Chinook salmon and Delta smelt, and I will too in a minute, but I wanted to make the point here that the direct effects of salvage or of export, of salvage at the export facilities is widespread and very large. So we've tabulated over here for a bunch of species. These are a bunch of species that are caught in salvage at the export facilities, and we've just averaged over the 1993 to 2011 period, that's the period for which data are available, the average number of these fish that are caught in salvage each year, and then for each species, the maximum that was ever recorded in 1 year. And down here at the bottom that you can barely see is a totaling up of the average yearly salvage at about 9 million fish. Is it?
The mic is coming in and out.
Do I need to switch? Maybe that's better. Is that better? Okay, thanks, Kenny. So down here we've totaled up the averages. About 9,200,000 fish are caught in salvage. I heard somebody yesterday say that the salvage facilities are like a sampling device. If they are like the worst sampling device you can imagine, because the number of fish that you catch in salvage, or that you imagine after expanding your salvage that you have caught in the salvage, is somewhere to get the actual number of fish that have died just in the export infrastructure, the canals that lead to the exports, the pumps themselves. You have to multiply salvage by a factor of tens to thousands. It depends on the fish, depends on the season, depends on the export conditions, etc. So your sampling device is accurate as long as you're willing to accept the expansion of either tens or thousands to get to some real number. The point, though, is that the number that you see in salvage is just the tip of the iceberg of this problem. If you were to multiply these numbers by tens or thousands, you get much bigger numbers. Of course, that doesn't count the larval fish, which aren't enumerated at all, and it doesn't count the fish that are dying outside of the direct the canals and tunnels that lead directly to the exports. Okay, the sort of indirect effects. This slide didn't come out well because I captured it off the web, but I wanted to say that I don't think there's much disagreement among the warring parties about the effects of exports on South Delta hydrodynamics, or their effects on threatened and endangered species and non-threatened and endangered species. After all, the State Department of Water Resources has proposed something called the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. It's proposed as a habitat conservation plan, and here's an image of the delta, and this faded line here is indicating the tunnel that the plan proposes to build under the delta to capture water in the north and bring it to the pumping facilities in the south and then export it south. And this tunnel and its associated infrastructure, the new diversion, it's being built to implement flow management changes to address the following flow-related issues for fish: reverse flows in Old River and Middle River, entrainment, salvage, and predation effects on native fish species due to South Delta intakes, etc. This tunnel is called Conservation Measure Number 1. Right? It's billed as a conservation measure. It's proposed by the State Department of Water Resources. And if the facility and its operations can be made to satisfy the water export contractors, they have agreed to pay for it to the tune of $24.7 billion. I'm sorry, the tunnel fraction of it is only $16 billion. But nevertheless, I don't know too many people who agree to a $16 billion fix to something that they don't think is a problem. So I'm going to stipulate that I think we all think that delta exports and associated hydrodynamics are a problem. Altered delta hydrodynamics, we talk a lot about the export pumping, but I think you've gathered, and some people have said directly, that the altered hydrodynamics arise from reduced inflows into the delta and the increased exports and the current delta geometry. And that's why it's hard to figure out the effect of what a particular metric is, because you've got all these other parts of the world that are varying. But those three legs of the stool make up your altered delta hydrodynamics puzzle. The negative effects are the direct mortality, which I showed you for some 20 fish, the fish that you catch at the salvage facilities. Then there's the pre-screen mortality, which happens on the way to the salvage facilities. But then beyond the infrastructure of the state and federal water pumps, you have the altered hydrology that alters behavioral cues for fishes and wildlife, leading to increased in-delta mortality. You also have, not directly related to export pumping per se, low dissolved oxygen in certain parts of the delta that are a result of the modification of the geometry and the flows into the delta. And then you have impacts to system-wide productivity that are both direct and indirect. So I mentioned the flows into the delta being a problem, and the poster child for low flows and the low flows coming into the delta would be the San Joaquin Valley. So the San Joaquin is the second largest tributary to the delta, and I'm showing on the y-axis here the percentage of the unimpaired flow that makes it out of the San Joaquin Valley to the delta in every year. And unimpaired flow is an estimate based on what kind of runoff there would be if there were no diversions and there were no dams. So it's an estimate, and then the amount of water that actually gets to the delta, by measuring it. And then this is, going through time. And I'm showing two time periods here, 1956 through 1987, 1988 through 2010. In another context, those time periods have a meaning, but here they're just valuable to show that less than 30%, these horizontal bars here are medians of these two time periods, and that less than 30% of the unimpaired flow makes it to the delta in the February through June period. So we're not getting a lot of inflow into the delta. Also, just to note, that median hasn't changed too much over these two time periods, so over the last, say, 60 years. What has changed is increasing direct exports from the delta, the state and federal water projects. That's why they get a lot of attention. This shows water exported in millions of acres of feet, million acre feet from 1956 up through, I think, 2013, last year. And obviously, these exports, when totaled up, are increasing. 2011 was the year of maximum exports from the system. We exported more than 6 million acre feet. It definitely was not the wettest year on record, but it is the year of maximum exports. So we're increasing the amount of water that flows out. And Klern and Jasby, in their 2012 paper, summarized the different segments of effect on delta hydrodynamics and delta outflows more eloquently than I will. I know it's in your reading list, so I hope you will go and read that paper. So the net then of having very low inflows to the delta and high and increasing exports from the delta is that you get these altered hydrodynamics. So here I'm looking at one variable. It's certainly not the only variable you could look at, but I'm looking at the days on which old and middle river flows are on average negative. The number of days that's occurred in a year from period back in the 1930s. Obviously, this is all calculated. We don't have sensors measuring this. Certainly not in the 1930s, but based on the calculations, you see that you don't get very many days in most years of average negative flows in the early part of this time series. But then beginning with the onset of state water project operations in the South Delta, you begin to see this number increase substantially. So that nowadays, about 2/3 of your year, water is flowing on average, tidally averaged, all that jazz, is flowing in a negative, it's flowing away from the bay in the bottom of the San Joaquin River. So I have a general conceptual model about altered hydrodynamics and effects on fish in particular. And it's a general model because the point that I'm trying to make is that you need a different model for each fish because of the way that the hydrodynamics interact with the fish behavior. The general model is that altered hydrodynamics, as I've mentioned, result from the interaction of inflows to the delta, direct exports, and the delta's current geometry, including gates and barriers and such. The biological effects of that are the product of species behavior, distribution, and the altered hydrodynamics at a given time. And the altered hydrodynamics affect different species and maybe different life stages of different species in different ways. As a result, the magnitude of the effects can change from year to year. So this is this notion that, this schematic of this pump impact zone over fish habitat, right, and this pump impact zone changes and the fish habitat changes, so the impacts change. As a result, a single metric or one that tracks a single mechanism of impact for altered delta hydrodynamics isn't necessarily going to provide you with the most widespread benefit. I like Kenny's use of the term yesterday of saying that your metric for measuring impacts of or regulating impacts of altered hydrodynamics, it's a surrogate. It's interesting and perhaps valuable to think about the direct mechanisms of what are fish behaving in response to, but that's not necessarily the best metric then to manage by. But the fact that different fish and wildlife species are affected in different ways suggests that maybe you might need more than one metric to provide the most comprehensive coverage for the ecosystem. Again, under the general conceptual model, delta flow factors affect different attributes of viability for different species. So here, this is from our, you don't have to read the fine print here. That's what they always say. You don't have to read the fine print. But this is from our presentation in 2010 to the State Board, where we divided types of flows: Delta outflows, San Joaquin River inflows, Sacramento River inflows, and Delta hydrodynamics into these different boxes, which are artificial boxes. And we divided viability of different species according to the NIMF's kind of nomenclature around this. There are 4 different attributes of species viability: abundance, spatial extent, life history diversity or genetic diversity, and productivity or stability. And those are unnatural as well, right? Those divisions, these factors tend to influence each other. But, you know, they're helpful but not perfect distinctions. And then we mapped onto these cells in this matrix where there were data to suggest that delta hydrodynamics affected delta smelt diversity, for instance. Okay, so let's get into some of these attributes of viability for different fish species. The loss of productivity or resilience, and to simplify it, I'm talking about survival rates of fish. Entrainment affects survival of fish. Entrainment or salvage of winter run Chinook salmon increases with export flow, according to Kimmerer, 2008. We know that the through delta survival of San Joaquin Basin Chinook salmon is 5% on average, less in dry years, higher in wet years. And the point of this is that this, as Kimmerer stated, this level of additional mortality at the export facilities may place constraints on the rate of recovery of listed winter and spring run stocks. So if you're trying to recover fish, having a bunch of them killed in any particular, from any particular point source is detrimental to progress on that front. Here's a fish that its entrainment patterns behave are different than Chinook salmon because of their different behavior. They actually tell a little bit of a simple story. This is the graph of my graph of delta outflow, March through May, with total annual entrainment of longfin smelt, or total annual salvage of longfin smelt. Again, the y-axis is log transformed. And you see a pretty straight line relationship, significant, explains about 50% of the salvage over time for longfin smelt. And the reason we believe that longfin smelt entrainment is inversely proportional to delta outflow is that delta outflow appears to move the longfin smelt population during its spawning and then hatching and incubation phase, either downstream if they're high outflows or upstream if they're low outflows. So at low outflows, when the longfin smelt population will be impacted by the effect of low outflows, you wind up getting the highest entrainment. And so that's obviously counterproductive for that population, and it affects its resilience. We got a little bit into OMR as a metric of entrainment effects yesterday, and I've got to say that I'm not religious about which metric of delta hydrodynamics you use, but I will say that for management purposes, I'm not sure this has come across clearly, that for management purposes, OMR is measured as a multi-day average, 14-day or 5-day in terms of salmon. And at this scale, conceptual models of net flow as a driver, if we want to call OMR a net flow metric, at this time step, conceptual models of net flow as a driver are supported for pelagic and migratory species. These are some graphs from Lenny Grimaldo et al.'s paper in 2009 showing increased salvage with increasingly negative OMR. I've just been thinking about this for the past 2 days because there's talk about Greg Gartrell mentioned it this morning, that fish sense the direction of flow and therefore they respond to that. I think the therefore is in question. I'm sure that they sense the direction of flow. I really doubt that migrating Chinook salmon cue on the direction of flow as a cue for which way, for orientation purposes in a tidal environment. That would never have made sense to migrate into a tidal environment and follow the flow back and forth twice a day so that on average you wound up in the ocean just doesn't strike me as a good model for Chinook salmon migration. But we can get more to that in the Q&A. Again, different life stages are affected by entrainment effects. Here, by entrainment, I mean not getting where you're going as quickly or successfully as you needed to get. Right? So I'm not talking about salvage in this particular case, but I'm talking about entrainment as a delay in getting where you needed to go that has negative consequences. San Joaquin River fall run Chinook salmon, the straying of their adults as they return to the delta is increased at high levels of export. The likely mechanism for that is they're looking around, sniffing around, trying to find San Joaquin water, but in the fall when they return, exports are many-fold times the inflow of San Joaquin water. So and the pumps are obviously near the San Joaquin inflow point. So most of the San Joaquin water signal has disappeared into the pumps, and it apparently affects adult Chinook salmon trying to find the San Joaquin River to return to spawn. So that's another productivity effect on a different species. But in a different class then of impacts, and one that we don't measure with high-grade statistics, or we don't attempt to measure with statistics, there's the issue of a range constriction. Having consistent mortality and altered delta hydrodynamics emanating from this one area is likely to reduce the viability of this area for spawning or as a migratory corridor. And I'm not suggesting that I can prove that the existence of the pumps has made this area inhospitable I can prove that it's inhospitable, but the fact that delta smelt and longfin smelt are spawning much less frequently in the South Delta than they did in the past, I don't know that I can prove to satisfy you that that's the effect of the pumps, but it's certainly consistent with that conceptual model that having that consistent impact in one place makes that one place not so good to return to spawn. And clearly for San Joaquin salmonids, both coming out of the San Joaquin and returning to the San Joaquin, having to go through this gauntlet, you could say that results in a range restriction for Central Valley Chinook salmon if it's taking out the second largest tributary in the drainage. Okay, a different kind of effect, one that we're more used to talking about, is abundance effects. How does entrainment events 1 year translate to populations in years to come? And we've had a lot of studies of this. It seems like we get more as we go. The rate of studies increases as we go forward. I just want to point out that for delta smelt, there seems to be. I was interested that Chuck is going to show. Chuck showed a similar graph to what I'm going to show you, and he reached the opposite conclusion. But I think there's a large degree of agreement that export effects and salvage and entrainment of delta smelt has abundance effects. Those effects don't happen in every year. They are not the only effect on delta smelt, but they are an effect, and you can detect them. And it's sort of amazing that you can detect them. Kimmerer points out in his 2011 interaction with P.J. Miller that a loss of delta smelt to export pumping on the order reported in his earlier paper can be simultaneously nearly undetectable in regression analysis and devastating to the population. This also illustrates how inappropriate statistical significance is in deciding whether an effect is biologically relevant. That said, in addition to Kimmerer's papers, here are 4 other sets of authors that have published life cycle-ish models of delta smelt, and they all, as I read them, reach very similar conclusions that no single factor explains the entire decline of delta smelt from the 1995 to 2005 period, but all of them conclude that entrainment and exports are among the most important factors, including Maunder and Doriso, although I've always wondered about that paper. It's presented as a modeling framework, and then adult entrainment comes out as one of the more important effects, and they conclude that that effect isn't believable, and so they kind of toss it, which leads me to question whether it was a successful modeling framework or not. But that aside, they do find this effect of adult entrainment. I mentioned BDCP before. It bills itself as a solution, potential solution to this entrainment problem. I didn't want to leave you with the impression that I felt that BDCP, as currently presented, will solve the entrainment problem. This is from the effects analysis for BDCP, and it's showing projections of proportional larval and juvenile loss to entrainment under different existing conditions, a no-action alternative that accounts for climate change, and then different alternatives of how to build and operate a BDCP. Those are the different colored bars. And then it analyzes those over different year types, wet, dry, critically dry, et cetera. And what I see in this is that none of these alternatives are very much different from each other in terms of the projected total entrainment of delta smelt. I mean, as a proportion of the population, we're projecting up to a quarter of the population to be entrained in critically dry years under any of these alternatives. But what's interesting to me is that the real effect is across these year types. You get big reductions in entrainment going from critical to dry to below normal to above normal years. Those year types are they're both hydrology, but also operational decisions about reservoir releases and export pumping, et cetera, that we make in the different year types. So what this says to me is that it is possible to affect delta smelt entrainment. It's not just that they all get entrainment no matter what. It seems to be affected by the interface of, or the interaction of hydrology and management for that hydrology. The alternatives that are proposed under the BDCP don't really seem to make that much of a difference. Finally, in terms of attributes of viability for particular species, we have identified potential life history diversity erosion. This was first brought up by Bennett in 2005, who found differential effects of entrainment on particular segments of the delta smelt population. In particular, he was pointing out the largest, most fecund females seem to be differentially affected by export pumping at a certain time. And that effect, you would expect an effect of similar nature on longfin smelt and Chinook salmon. Basically, anytime that your exports are affecting one or the other end of your diversity spectrum in terms of migration timing or spawning timing, you have either a genetic selective force or at least a phenotypic selective force, and diversity, life history diversity seems to be the central organizing theme of native fish in the Central Valley ecosystem. So eliminating that diversity erodes the viability of the organism you're talking about. And so finally, in terms of entrainment effects, again, we've talked about these 4 attributes of viability for species: loss of productivity, range constriction, abundance effects, life history diversity erosion. But then there's a loss of productivity system-wide. I'm talking about food production here. Again, remember I said every 2 seconds this room and all its contents would be sucked into the South Delta pumping operations. That includes a lot of phytoplankton and a lot of zooplankton. In a 2002 paper, Alan Jasby estimated that the net effect of this on phytoplankton biomass might be equivalent to 30% of delta primary production. So if you're really focused on improving the primary productivity of this ecosystem, which is obviously challenged and important to restore, again, you can't ignore the effect of withdrawing that much water and everything that's in it from the system. This is a different metric. That was to show that 3 boxcars, under different circumstances of export, it's 3 50-foot boxcars worth of water and food are exported every second. So you can see that again. Bam. It's a lot. And I'm close to the end. There are additional impacts of altered hydrodynamics. It's not all about entrainment. Entrainment and salvage, those direct effects, are compelling because you have bodies in the hand and you have a big structure and you have big pumps and it's all very easy to capture in your mind. But export restrictions in the water quality control plan, in the current water quality control plan, have led CVP and SWP operations to shift exports, and as a result, releases from the upstream reservoirs, delta inflow, towards the summer and fall, okay, because it's less expensive in terms of water cost to export during the fall than it is for water that's in the system in the spring. And this results in an altering the shape of the hydrograph, which I plotted here for a wet year, median year, and a dry year. The blue line representing the unimpaired flow if the system had no diversions or dams, the red line representing what actually flows through the system. And it's the alteration of the shape of that hydrograph that affects species behavior and distribution. Cross-channel gate operations, as we've heard, alters the distribution and the susceptibility to entrainment of fish. Low dissolved oxygen in the southern delta forms migration barriers that constrict the geographic range of things trying to get up the San Joaquin. And also there's the notion that's becoming more and more established that these exports, well, let me back up. The altered hydrodynamics caused by both exports and low delta inflows favor invasive species. There's a paper from Winder and Jasby 2012 relating invasion of the Amur clam to those kind of altered hydrodynamics. And in the same year, Moyle et al. Said the delta has shifted into a different assemblage of dominant organisms, which reflects an altered physical environment in which the delta has become simplified into a channelized conveyance system to support export of freshwater from and through the estuary during summer and to reduce freshwater outflows at other times of years. So there are a lot of different effects of altered hydrodynamics and several different contributing factors to those altered delta hydrodynamics. My larger point is that the altered delta hydrodynamics clearly have an effect on this ecosystem. They clearly have an important effect. They are not the only effect, but that doesn't mean we can afford to not address the effect of altered hydrodynamics. And in terms of figuring out what the effect is and how to manage it, you can look to each species to figure out how is it responding to these altered hydrodynamics. But in the end, I think you probably need more coarse scale management-oriented metrics like OMR or the E to I ratio to manage the altered hydrodynamics. And with that, I'll take questions.
So we're actually getting to the time when we want to bring the rest of our presenters up from today. So anyone that presented this morning, I'll have them come up too, and then you guys can ask questions to whoever you want, including John and whoever else we had up here today. So all those questions you've been accumulating, you can